That's okay. I don't want to elaborate. One more space.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So, how's everybody doing today? Good. Just kind of get a random poll, just kind of feel for the room. How many would consider themselves educators, junior high, high school, higher ed, something along those lines? Okay, awesome.
Yes, big on memorization.
Yes. Who would consider themselves students? And hopefully everybody's raising their hand because everybody should be a lifelong learner, right? So let's go ahead and get started. So as you can see, the title for my presentation is Teach for Understanding, Not Memorization. There's definitely a difference between the two. A little bit about me. My name is Tasha Penwell. I'm a certified solutions architect associate level. I'm also an AWS educator, a Restart instructor, an AWS Academy instructor, an AWS Educate instructor and cloud ambassador, and a women's Techmaker ambassador, which is a Google thing, but that's fine. Now, a couple of things to note. On the far, your right-hand side, you can see some of the schools that I taught at in the past or am currently teaching at. One thing to note about me is I am hearing impaired. So I don't necessarily, hearing is not my strength. I wear hearing aids, but sometimes pitches, tones, echoes, all of those things come into play. So what I would like to do, if it feels like I'm having trouble understanding anybody, that's my cell phone number. Text me your question, and that might be the easiest way to, and you can use that after our session is over today as well. If you have any questions. So rules for my classroom. So I showed you a list of some schools that I teach at, and one of them is you got to communicate with me. I was a non-traditional student. I was 28 when I finally finished my associate's degree. I did that working multiple jobs and being a single mom. So I understand if you are in a similar, if you're in a similar situation that, you may be struggling, having the similar struggles as I was, balancing time and commitments. And you got to communicate with me. If something's going on, just tell me what's going on and then we'll work around it. But that being said, you have to do the work. You can't get around that. Communication, if you have something going on, communicate with me, but that's not an excuse to not do the work. Because ultimately, I will not work harder for your education than you do. And this is something, first day of class, I tell my students, basically, you have to do the work. There's no magical wand, there's no fairy dust, there's none of that stuff that I can do for you. If you don't do it, then I can't help you. So, and education is for understanding. It's not to regurgitate. It's not for memorization. It is for understanding. And this actually, I was probably in my 30s before I actually kind of realized this, personal experiences. When growing up, I was considered the smart kid. I didn't really need to study.
Your mic is not working.
What's wrong with that?
It's not working.
Oh. Thank you. Okay, how's that? Big difference. Okay, thank you. So I was like the smart one. I didn't need to study, did well in school. So I didn't really develop good study habits whenever I was growing up. And, when you're growing up, that's awesome. I don't need to study and I do well. But when you're actually an adult, it's like, oh, this is hard. So I learned in my 30s how to learn for understanding and not just to memorize it, because there is a huge difference, which is why whenever I see students struggling, I just reinforce this. You need to learn to understand, and you're learning how to learn when you're in my classroom. And that is such a big thing that I don't think some students understand, that there's a concept that they need to learn how to learn in your classroom. And so when they go in the workforce, they're better prepared. So my experience teaching AWS. It started with AWS Educate. Show of hands, who's familiar with AWS Educate? Okay, I see one. No. What about AWS Academy? Okay. And what about AWS Restart? Okay. So I'm going to start with AWS Educate. I do have some links in here. You guys will get the slides, and I'm not necessarily going through every individual link just for the sake of time, but after we're done, if there's any Q&A, we can definitely go back. So AWS Educate is the platform AWS created to teach junior high, high school level, and higher ed as well. So it previously was only available if you had a .edu email account. So basically, if you're an educator or a student, you had access to it. But that's changed over the past year or so, and it's now available to anybody. There is no credit card required, and obviously, if you're 13, 13-year-olds probably not going to have a credit card available to them, and mom and dad may not really trust giving them a credit card to explore AWS. So that's one of the benefits if somebody's around junior high level and they're curious about AWS, or if you want to teach them about AWS, it's a really great platform. It includes modules and labs, and it's very tailored based off interest, whether just a basic level or if they're interested in something like machine learning and deep racer, gaming, whatever they have an interest in, there's a great way to tailor to the interest of the students. And once you tailor to the interest of the students, you can see that light just kind of click, that they're interested and they're engaged and they want to learn because they want to learn, as opposed to they're just going through the motions because they have to. So there's a little screenshot from AWS Educate. Again, there's a link, and we can go back and see how time is at the end of our day and explore some of those resources. But you guys will have the slides with the links when they send them out. So some of the benefits of AWS Educate is it's simple and barrier-free. Like I said, there's no credit card needed. You gain access to hands-on labs, to the console, and it's content designed for beginners. So very basic level. They have no experience working with anything technology or understanding the capital expenditures and the cost savings. This is designed for them. And connection to employment. Now there is a job board associated with it. I don't know how well it's aligned with beginners, like internships, but there is a job board if they're just curious to see what the job opportunities are out there. Okay. AWS Academy, I think there was a few more hands that were raised for AWS Academy. AWS Academy, I used to work at Hawking College, and the backstory of how I actually learned about AWS. In 2018, I came to Hawking College as a computer science program manager, trying to find resources to help build a better program. And I read about a school in New Mexico, as a community college, who started using cloud computing in their education. So I actually reached out to AWS and Google to see, what kind of resources were available for community colleges. AWS is the one that got back with me first, and that's the only reason I hopped on the AWS train wagon, and I've never left. But AWS Academy is available through approved institutions. The resources are at no cost to the institutions. You do have to have an approved educator to teach them. So that is the caveat. It's like, there's no cost for the resources, but you got to pay for the educator. No credit card is required for the students. So even though these are higher ed, college level, or adults, that's still a barrier. For some of them, like whenever the whole idea of putting a credit card number in, they're just like, no. So no credit card is required for the students, which helps remove that barrier. And again, there's modules and labs, and there's a sandbox, which gives them more room to play in a very controlled environment where they don't have to worry about accruing a cost.
Do you have to have like a college domain email?
No, but you usually in the institutions I've taught, you have to pay them, and then once you're registered in that class, then the instructor will add you to the class, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a non-credit unless the institution has it for credit in some way, however they got it set up. But basically you say, hey, for example, Hawking College, I want to enroll in this particular class. It's like, okay, you pay X amount of dollars, and then the instructor will enroll you in the class. Okay. Some of the benefits to AWS Academy, so you can become, for institutions, become a leader in cloud education. In 2019, 2020, I think is whenever Hawking College became an AWS Academy partner institution. And at that time, if you look at the list of AWS Academy institutions in the state of Ohio, I think we were one of 2. So that was pretty cool, but we were, kind of that early. There's more now. But, there's a list of institutions that can have that kind of accreditation. And for an institution, they're able to develop and retain educators, which, institutions need. For educators, they have access to cloud courses. They can receive complimentary AWS professional training, which, has been nice and helpful. And they can also receive discounts on AWS certifications exams. Students, they get to be able to land a well-paid job in one of the fastest growing industries and gain skills. And again, they also get a certificate discount. And employers, they can just close those cloud skill gaps that we all know exist right now. AWS Restart. So the thing about AWS Academy, I didn't mention, there's an expectation that you have some basic skills, whether it be business or tech, like very minimum, but you need to know like what an IP address is. You need to have some idea how networks work. You don't need in-depth knowledge, but you need like basic level of understanding with AWS Academy. And that AWS Academy can be taught in as few as 2 weeks, not recommended, but it can be taught in as few as 2 weeks if it's full-time. AWS Restart. AWS Restart is a full-time classroom-based skills developed and training program. So what that means is, I think if you were doing around 30, 40 hours a week in the classroom full-time, you can complete it in 12 weeks. The one I'm currently teaching is at half-time, and it's about 24 weeks is for the length of the program. Now, what's different about Restart from Academy is it teaches, if you have no background in technology, this will teach you, okay? It's the very, very basics. It teaches you about Linux. It teaches you about what a network is. It teaches you about IP addresses. It teaches you about CIDR notations. It teaches all that very, very basic stuff. And when I first started teaching Restart, I wasn't fully, I got access to the course about a half hour before my first day of class. So I'm like, okay, haven't had much time to preview it, but that's okay, we'll make do. So once I actually started, understanding it and seeing what the curriculum was about, I was kind of thinking it was going to be AWS Academy, where everything is about AWS. It's about VPCs, it's about their storage, it's about their databases. Everything with AWS Academy is AWS. That's not the case with Restart. So whenever they were doing a long focus on Linux, I'm like, why are we talking about Linux? Why are we not going straight into the VPCs? And then once I realized what it was doing is trying to lay the groundwork, because the expectation is not everybody has, IT skills or background in it. And it was fun. I mean, I haven't done anything with Linux since I was an undergrad, so I was kind of like, doing a fast refresher myself and kind of relearning the stuff, with the students, but it was fun. And I shared that with the students, and the purpose of me sharing that with the students is to kind of help them feel more comfortable with imposter syndrome. Does everybody know what imposter syndrome is? Okay. So, help them feel more comfortable with the things that they weren't familiar with. And it helps prepare them for, careers in the cloud. It connects them to potential employers. Now, just like I said earlier, that I will not work harder for your education than you do, connecting them to potential employers, I also expect the students to put their own legwork in. Ask them to have a LinkedIn account. It's like, who's got a LinkedIn account? Some yes, some no. If it's a yes, it's like, how active are you on it? And usually most of them are no. Okay. It's like, you need to get active on LinkedIn. And there's no ifs and buts about it. If you just need to be active on LinkedIn if this is the career that you want to do. And some grumble about it, but it's the reality of it. Technology background is not required, and the program is focused on unemployed or underemployed individuals. Now, when I first heard about Restart, I thought it was more for people re-entering into society, like maybe they were incarcerated or they're been in recovery from drug and alcohol rehabilitation, but that wasn't the case. It was basically for anybody who's underemployed and wants to start a career. Now, the Restart program is no cost to the students, but you have to be approved. Again, I said earlier, it's a very more time-intensive course. It's 12 weeks if it's full-time, 24 weeks if it's half-time. So you have to make that commitment. But it is free. You can build skills aligned to AWS certification, and you can connect with employers and start your career. And then again, I go back to you need to be active on LinkedIn. I tell students you need to be active on LinkedIn, and you need to attend meetups, and you need to attend conferences. Not all conferences cost money. This one I think was what, $20? Some conferences are with AWS are a lot more than that. But you can find the free ones or meetups. Meetups are usually no cost, and they usually have pretty good food if you're able to attend one in person. So attend those. But again, you have to do the work. So again, I know we're about AWS, but I love Steve Jobs. Every time I tell my husband that I have to do, that I get the either doing a presentation or have a new teaching position about AWS or something with Apple, he's thrilled because that means I have somebody else to talk to about AWS or Steve Jobs other than him, because he gets tired of hearing about it. But any Steve Jobs fans in here? Sure. Okay. So it gave a tremendous level of self-confidence that through exploration and learning, one could understand seemingly very complex things in one's environment. When you first start learning about AWS, it is complex, it's overwhelming, right? I used to work for a medical college, and a physician told me going to medical school was trying to drink from a water hose. Or from a fire hose, yeah.
This job is harder than being a doctor.
And at least the body pretty much stays the same as opposed to anything. The console itself is frustrating, trying to stay on top with it when it changes, like the weather in Ohio. But, trying to learn anything new can be very daunting. And AWS is no different than that. But what's nice is whenever somebody says they don't know how to do something, it's like, well, nobody knows how to do it till they learn. That's the whole point of you coming here. But again, you got to do the work. So the curriculum, it kind of varies a little bit depending on the Educate, the Academy, or the Restart, but most of them are pretty much comprised of short modules created by solutions architect cloud engineers from AWS. They have labs and there's knowledge checks. The things that I add is the documentation scavenger hunt. If I had to change two things on the way AWS does their curriculum, is have more focus on the documentation. There's not a lot of focus on the documentation. They give you modules, they give you some slides, but they don't make you look at the documentation. Because learning how to navigate and find answers in documentation is a skill in itself. And knowing how to do that is going to help them better prepare to learn how to learn so that they can find their own solutions instead of calling on the teacher or whatever resource. But the documentation can be a little daunting itself, whether you have the HTML or the PDF format. I prefer the HTML format. Does anybody prefer the HTML over PDF? Who prefers the PDF of thousands of pages long? Okay. What is it?
I like PDF because they're more just affordable to have on my phone offline or something.
Yeah, well, there are some benefits to it. I just usually find it daunting when I open up a PDF. It says hundreds or thousands of pages. Like, that's a lot.
Just control F and find what you're looking for at some point.
Yeah.
It might be a few thousand results, though.
So whenever we're learning about a particular subject, like, whether it be VPCs or S3, I have them go to the link for the documentation and just like the very basics, usually like the about or the abstract or just like the very introduction, and have them, have some questions like, find the answer here in this documentation page. And that helps them, get more comfortable with it. Kahoot, who's familiar with Kahoot? Is anyone, a few? Okay, awesome. So Kahoot, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a way to gamify education, and it keeps things engaging in the classroom. So especially I teach online right now, and if online classes, they're kind of like soul sucking if, nobody wants to engage. But Kahoot makes that a little bit better. So you can do it as a game, or I've also been doing it as a study guide. So if I'm doing it as a game, I usually limit it to 10 or 15 questions. It's competition. If you're not familiar with it, there's a time you answer the questions. It's usually multiple choice and whatnot. Now you can do it as a study guide where you assign it, and students like using that as a study guide. And I usually do 50 to 70 questions on a study guide. And there's also guided notes. So you can see some links in here when you get the slides. You can click on the links, and if we can go back if we have time during the Q&A. But there's guided notes. So guided notes are something that I started doing for students, again, because you're learning a lot of new content. And let me go ahead and open that one up. It's easier to explain that one if it'll let me. We'll do it later. But basically, so basically, there's 3 or 4 sections of a guided notes. There are some where just terminology, like you're learning some new terminology today. Go ahead and write out the definitions and the things that your takeaways from the terminology. Some of them are kind of fill in the blank, and then some of them are schematics, draw it out. Another thing that I wish the AWS curriculum did include it more for instruction to the students is to draw out the schematics, because the cloud is intangible, right? You can't really touch it, So drawing out the schematics when you're learning about VPCs and availability zones and subnets and all of that stuff, and especially when you get more intricate, more detailed with like the internet gateway, the NAT gateway, things of that nature, it helps with the retention and understanding when they draw out the schematic. It doesn't have to be pretty, just draw it out, see how it all relates to each other. And that's going to help you with the terminology as well, and understanding how all those things relate. And then it's recommended they have an AWS account. Depending on what kind of curriculum we're on, they may not have access to a lab or a full breadth of lab resources that they can actually explore and play with a little bit. Because even if you do have a lab through like AWS Educate or AWS Academy, there are some restrictions on like IAM. There's some things that you cannot do that you just need to have access to an AWS account. So putting it together, there's a couple of different ways that I put this together whenever I present it to my students and I teach a class. So here's one version. I created a Kahoot based on the modules in the slides. There's usually 30 to 70 questions. And again, this is something that I create. This takes probably for every class, it's about 2 or 3 hours of prep work for me to make these questions, to read the slides, prepare, make the questions. But the beauty of it is like they're easy to be reused for the next class. They are assigned and it's not a competition. I do have the paid version of Kahoot, so I don't know what's free and what's the paid version. But you can assign them so the students can still go through the process of doing the games, and it's just at their own, on their own pace. And they really like it. Like even when I do a game, and I don't make it as an assignment, they ask if I can make it an assignment so they can do it on their own. And what I've noticed is whenever I started doing these Kahoots and these guided notes, that whenever we do the review the questions in class, okay, number 2 first. Review the questions in class that students perform the worst on. So with Kahoot, you can see the statistics of how well students did. If there are questions that they had more and more trouble with, then we'll go over those in more detail. If there were questions and concepts that, all the students did pretty well on, we're not gonna cover those. Because there's nothing I hate worse as a teacher is reading slides. I hate being read to. I hate, if I was a student and students don't like it, I hate doing it as a teacher, as reading slides. Because what tends to happen is like, do you guys all read a slide? Does anybody have any questions on this? It's usually crickets. It's like, nobody has any questions on anything. It is the most soul-sucking experience as a teacher. But if they're doing poorly on these Kahoots, like, okay, you guys don't got this. Let's go ahead and review it and discuss and have conversations about it. And sometimes, because again, I do all of these from scratch, from reading the slides and creating it. It maybe might be the way I said it, maybe the way I phrased the question they didn't understand, or the way they interpreted it was different than what I intended. That's a conversation we're having, and that's going to help not only that particular student, but everybody else have a better understanding of the concepts that we're discussing. And it helps me as a teacher. It's like, okay, if I didn't express this the right way, then I need to know that for next time. And then, like I said, we'll just review the slides and the resources. There's more conversation, and it's a more engaging online classroom environment. If there's a lab, they complete the lab. Not all modules have a lab associated with it. So what I try to do, as time allows, is I try to find like a tutorial or a basic how-to that's found on AWS, all the resources they have, so they know how to find them. And then they use the free lab that they have access to, through whatever their program is. And I usually try to test it first because, like I said, with the sandbox environment, with the Restart or the Academy or the Educate, there are some limitations. So I try to test it to make sure it can be successfully completed, or let them know, it's like, we'll get to this point and then it won't work anymore because it's a lab. But they get to have that experience. And then we're going to complete the knowledge checks. What I've noticed and what the students have told me since we start doing the Kahoot and the guided notes, if you're not familiar with the knowledge checks, they're basically 5 to 10 questions at the end of a section. And it's you can take as many times as you need to get 80% correct. What students have told me is, like, after doing the Kahoot and the guided notes, that they're able to pass usually at 100% of the knowledge checks the first time, which is really like the whole point of that. That tells me that, doing it that way is working, as opposed to me reading slides and nobody having questions, but learning that nobody understands anything yet. And then we read the documentation on the subject as relevant and at the level for what they're studying on right now. The other thing we do is review case studies. So AWS has a whole website devoted to customer stories or case studies, whichever one you want to call it. So whenever we're learning about something, there's a way that you can filter it down based off the kind of technology. Maybe you're learning about S3. You can filter down to all the case studies of companies using S3. And it's dependent upon the class. Sometimes I'll let them choose whichever kind of industry they have an interest in. Gaming is usually a popular example. Find gaming companies that are using S3 and see what they did. Okay, it's giving like a real life scenario of how they're using S3 storage. If my class is a little less than motivated to find their own, area of interest, I give them an assignment. It just, again, it kind of depends upon the class. And another way that I do this, if I don't do the Kahoots as a study guide, I create my own guided notes. So I mentioned earlier, there's terminology, draw it out, fill in the blank, and open-ended questions. I do a Kahoot as a review at the end, but it's only 10 to 20 questions if I do the guided notes, because there's only 24 hours in the day. And when you're creating this from scratch, it takes time. Then again, everything else is pretty much the same. Review the questions. I can see how well the students perform, complete the lab, complete the knowledge checks, review the documentation, and review case studies. So with the documentation, what we usually do with the documentation is we do scavenger hunts. I mentioned scavenger hunts earlier. Basically, I have a question and, I make sure it's stated plainly within the documentation. It's more or less kind of fill in the blank, but they have to go through the action of reading it and finding the answer. And to get them more comfortable with doing it. I use guided notes. I make guided notes and then have them find the answers in the documentation. And then they're seeing the terminology being used in context. Okay, so sometimes just the terminology is getting comfortable with the terminology is a skill in itself. And then they increase their comfort level navigating the documentation. Again, whether if you have a preference for PDF or HTML, they can kind of figure out what they like at this learning stage. So whenever they're in their next stage, actually being, working for a company, they have more increased comfort level of just knowing how to find the answer to a solution instead of being overwhelmed by all of that that's in there. Case studies, so again, they can see real life scenarios of how companies are using AWS and maybe like how they either are taking advantage of an opportunity or we're solving a problem. So whenever there's a case study, whenever we use case studies, the students have to do like maybe a 2-minute presentation. What the company was that they learned about. What was the problem that the company had? Was it storage? Was it things need to be updated? Was it a database issue? Whatever the problem was. What solutions did they use? Did they use S3 storage? And what was the outcome? Were the cost savings? Was it more efficient? Was it faster? Whatever. So they're seeing it in real life scenario of how a company is doing it and the outcome from it. And just to kind of follow up on the whole LinkedIn thing, I encourage the students, find that company or that person, or to give you a name of an individual, find them on LinkedIn, follow them, connect with them, send them a message, like, visit a person, it's like, hey, I read about how your company did XYZ, but using AWS, thought it was really cool, and I'm looking to learn more about AWS, okay? It doesn't have to be an ask for something, you're just like making that connection. You're building your network early on. So some principles in learning. Let's see. So learners use what they already know to construct new understanding. So whenever we do case studies, I try to let them, if they already have an interest in something, they already know gaming and all that's involved with the gaming, that's going to help them have a better understanding of how things work within a gaming system. Learners have different strategies, approaches, patterns of abilities, and learning styles. I think everybody knows that. Everybody has their own particular learning style. Their motivation to learn and sense of self affects what is learned, how much is learned, and how much effort they will be put into the learning processes. And the practices and activities in which people engage while learning shape what is learned, and it's enhanced through socially supported interaction. So we use platforms like Slack and Discord to communicate with each other and to share, just to share. So the message I give to students, like, you will fail. We talked about failures and a couple of other, like I think the keynote addressed it, and there, I know it's in some other presentations where they talked about you will fail. And that is okay. I just want to make sure my alarm doesn't go off. So I tell the students, have my 3 things in the beginning, and then I also say, oh, by the way, you're going to fail. And just accept it. And what failing means is labs will not always work. You will have to reread the documentation several times over. You are going to have to search the unfamiliar terminology. If they use terms that you're not familiar with, guess what? Google's your best friend. You'll find it. But fail is the first attempt in learning. I heard that at a conference, I don't know, a couple of years ago. I'm like, that's awesome. I'm using it whenever I present. And it's okay to fail. And I know I've done some labs with AWS where I'm like, when I first started learning about AWS, it's like, okay, it says to click this button and this button and this button and this button. It's like, it's done. I was like, that's awesome. I have no idea what I did, but that's awesome. But when I break things, I'm like, oh, crap. Now I have to figure things out. And as you may know, documentation does not always keep up to pace with the console. And sometimes that is a learning curve in itself. It's like, just accept it and embrace it and know that you're going to learn from it. So AWS also has some additional resources. Again, these are links when you'll get the PowerPoint. Provides multiple resources at no charge. There's webinars, like there's a whole page devoted to AWS webinars that you can attend. And then there's AWS Skill Builder. Who's familiar with Skill Builder? One couple. So with Skill Builder, it's free. The way you log in is, does everybody have an Amazon.com account?
Oh, yeah.
You can log in using your Amazon.com credentials. Okay, it doesn't have to be Prime, but if you've ever bought anything on Amazon before, which I'm going to go ahead and make an assumption, the answer is yes. You can log in with those credentials, and there's a great resources for you to learning from the basic fundamentals to more advanced. You do not need to rely on outside purchases. And it's just a matter of finding the right resources for you and making the most out of them. And I'm on pretty much all the social media platforms, but those are the ones you're going to find me actually being active on. So feel free to find me and connect with me on those. And you have my phone number. Feel free to text me. You can try calling, but no guarantees I'll answer, or be nice if I answer if I don't know who you are. Just sorry. Okay. Okay, now we can, looks like, I think how much time do we have? Let's see. Are we okay on time? Okay, awesome. Questions?
A couple questions.
Yeah.
One, if you go back to different modules for the training, so educate, restart, and
Academy?
Okay, academy. So you said no credit card for one of them.
Yes. Actually, no credit card for all of them.
Yeah.
But I'm not an educator. I'm not a student. I'm just somebody off the street looking to learn AWS.
So if you are not an educator or student, and if you don't want to enroll, like you're wanting to be like self-learn, or do you want to enroll with a program, like and pay hundreds of?
Self-learn.
Okay. So Educate, it used to be just for educators and students. They opened it up.
Okay.
Okay.
And then you said no credit card, so there has to be a limit somehow. Do you know, I'm not sure if you do or not, but do you know if the resources will stick around for a period of time, or that everything gets deleted like an hour later?
For some of them, I think the Educate has $100 limit credit. And the labs that they create, they after a certain time they go away. It's not something you can do like a long-standing project.
And one last thing, do you know if corporate can use something like that, or?
I think the biggest thing that they would probably need to pay with Educate, anybody can use it. AWS Academy has to be a certain institution, like higher ed, for example. So they would need to have an educator. Sure. And AWS Restart, you have to be certain institutions. Yeah. So to answer your question, corporate, if I was corporate, I would go to Skill Builder. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm just getting close searches to help with my hearing.
I was just curious regarding restart, since it's for like young people and people who don't have to do it. Would there be much of any work or reason to go into it?
To restart?
Because regarding people like me, even though I'm young, I'm also in the middle of IT associate's degree. So I'm not sure whether or not that would count as an experience, and whether I'd end up learning anything in that. But also like the study sets.
Students like it. That's why I spend like so much time spending it, because the students are getting the benefit of it, which is the whole name of the game.
I prefer something like Kahoot or Quizlet than just
Yeah.
the textbook, like, is this Swedish?
Yes. So Restart, I think you mentioned Restart earlier. Is that what you were saying earlier? Is that one of the programs you mentioned you was asking about?
I was just wondering regarding Restart, because like Educate and Academy are learning for everyone, but Restart you mentioned is for, I guess lower level is the way to say that people who just haven't really done anything.
But it's only available through certain institutions. Like a certain institution, say they're a Restart institution, they teach Restart, then you would have to apply through that institution and then be approved and all of that stuff.
Is there too much
It does a lot. I mean, I think there's benefit to it, but it does do a lot of basic, like you have no experience in IT or business. For some students, I think they might find that repetitive or kind of boring, but they're still beneficial. I mean, it's also a bit of commitment. If you're already in school, it's a full-time commitment.
I didn't mean like immediately.
Oh, okay.
Like, would there be reason anymore to try and get into it after getting an associate, whatever, because then you already have.
I don't think so, honestly. If for something like that, I would probably recommend Skill Builder.
Okay, I'll look at that.
Yeah.
Just because it's kind of, sure, I can learn what it says.
Yeah, I would recommend Skill Builder.
All right.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions? Skill Builder's awesome. If you got an Amazon.com account, boom, you're in there.
I don't want to order anything from it.
That's fine, just make one. Any other questions? Okay, that's pretty much all I got. You guys got my number. You guys, like I said, LinkedIn and Facebook are the ones I'm most active on. And thank you for your time and attention today. So what do I do?
Nothing.
Okay.
Pretty much emptied out.
Okay.
I can take care of it.
Here, I'll stick with that. I won't break it.
Can't break it, I promise.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Always. You work for us? Yeah, you guys are all in WS?
So, but thank you for your question. I would recommend Skill Builder.
I'll let you find your PowerPoint.
Compared to what they're talking about, we are not.
But it's all there, it's all virtual, we use the services.
I'm down with it. Yeah?
Yeah, and remember, the target audience is junior high. So.
I got Ron the home.
Yes.
The building up to.
They've done a lot of changes.
Small footprint comes to the landing zone.
You got two accounts.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have any questions for me?
There's something like the old recording better, but they actually do a lot.
The only way you advance is space bar or use the arrow keys. And if you need my phone, on and off.
Yeah, same here. So. In a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think you're.
Yeah,
Yeah, you just kind of shut it out.
Because I think this, whenever you're using the modules on like AWS Academy and whatnot, you just kind of make the assumption this will teach me creativity.
I mean, I don't know if I get assumption because I haven't kind of used it. It's just that I'm not sure really what how to understand because looking at the documentation doesn't always let me using another thing.
I mean, that's why I try to do a guided notes. It's very simplistic.
Copy database, yep. Where's everybody?
I guess we finish this session in a couple of minutes early.
Yeah. Yeah, talking all about Aurora serverless stuff. It's kind of interesting to see what, I'm curious how the code starts on there versus other stuff.
But if you get those slides, check it out, and if you have any questions, let me know.
We'll start in a couple of minutes.
Right. So, where is their office? Dublin. I used to work with them in PA. In Right. 2 minutes past. I think let's get started. So good afternoon, guys. See the cloud really take off. That's why we are here. And the focus of this presentation is databases. So I'm going to be comparing RDS and Aurora. And as a takeaway, I'm going to try to equip you to make the right choice. So we start with an introduction to RDS and Aurora, a very high-level introduction. Okay. Then we look at the suitability, comparison, some use cases where they can be useful, and then to close off, where RDS and Aurora really shine. If you have questions, sure, you can go ahead and interrupt me. We can also do Q&A later. And here's a little bit about me. So I've been working with as a cloud and data architect with Persistent now. I'm 4x AWS certified. I have the big data specialty and the database specialties. My email is on the slide. If you have questions after this, sure, you can email me. If we can't get to those questions right now, or we need more exploration into those questions, please feel free to contact. So we are all here. They're a mix of data and cloud technologists. And frequently, senior cloud engineers, architects, data engineers are called upon to make technology selections. We get into this cycle of select, implement, maintain, and improve. The part that I'm going to focus on today is more around select. And that's the part that we will walk through, making a technology choice. But it's an important part of your job as a cloud leader, growing in your cloud role, making the right technology choice. Your organizations have come to depend on you to make the right choices. Choices like these have long-term impacts and very real business impacts. So you're expected to follow a process, a proper guidance on what should be the right choice. The business requirements like cost, availability, performance. So as a side note to this presentation, as we are comparing RDS and Aurora, what I'm also going to walk through is the technology selection process. We are already here. That means we've made the selection. We've made the decision to go with a relational database. We've just made the decision to go MySQL, Postgres. We've made the decision to have a managed offering. The fork in the road is really RDS or Aurora. And we're migrating from on-premise databases, or we're selecting a new database. That's where we're starting from. So RDS being a new technology, it's often a case that we're not able to keep pace with the new technology developments. Not everybody can keep track of everything. Our learning at work, whether always is very rarely intentional and most often accidental. We learn most about the things that we work on, things that we are really hands-on, or things that at our fringes of what we are working on. If you're curious about something, you'll go and read about things, you'll listen to podcasts, you look at videos and so on. And that's how you start picking up things that are at the fringes of what you're working on. As working technologists, we rarely have time to do intentional learning. So it's there that these talks, reinvent sessions by webinars and other things that help us get through new technology improvements that make us get the right choice. Right. So again, as a takeaway, it's to equip you to make the right choice. And then we'll look at the two technologies, RDS and Aurora. So RDS is a managed relational database. Very simplistically and conceptually, RDS is a wrapper. It packages best practices, automation, easy configurability into a core offering around the database. Aurora, on the other hand, is a more full-scale replacement. You can think of Aurora as the result of a transplant surgery. The entire storage engine has been replaced, whether it's MySQL or Postgres. And the storage engine has been replaced by by an intelligent storage layer composed of EC2s and SSDs attached to it. There's an S3 backend. And this storage layer very smartly processes your commit log. Aurora is built on the core foundational AWS services like EC2, S3, SWF, VPC, things that we know are rock solid. This is a derived service. It is composed of of the building blocks of these age-old services that AWS has perfected. This intelligent storage layer is built for reliability and performance. So what's the sweet spot that AWS is playing in? If you have a Microsoft always-on cluster, if you have an Oracle RAC environment, what's the equivalent on MySQL and Postgres? Is there something that compares reliability or availability at that scale? And Aurora is really an answer to that question. Aurora fills the gap where open source technologies are no longer in the realm of the DIYs, self-configured. It is an engine where availability and reliability are completely built in. There's no guesswork, there's no DIY element, there is no keeping you up at night, and will this really work, or will it really keep you up? keep you up, kind of thing. The two key components of Aurora are the separation or the architectural highlights really, are separation between compute and storage. And the second is how well it handles the commit log. The commit log for Aurora is equivalent to the database itself. The database engine no longer deals with pages or blocks, it deals with the commit log. And it is the storage engines, the intelligent storage engines' responsibility to now navigate through manipulating the commit log, storing it, and then reading and writing. Okay, let me stop now. Do you have any questions? Anything that you need to discuss in depth? First, let's get into the comparison points now. This is the first comparison point we're looking at the performance. So, like we said, the right performance of Aurora is really log records go to the update queue, and the update queue goes to the storage nodes. If you look at how the write performance is in RDS, RDS has a buffer cache. The updates happen to the buffer cache. And then there is a checkpointer process or a log writer process, depending on the database you're talking about. And then that pushes the nodes, the pages or the blocks. Pages in terms of MySQL, blocks in Postgres, they're pushed to storage. Here, very little IOPS is happening because only the commit log is transmitted to the storage layer. So you get much improved IOPS. And that's why the writer is claimed to be about 5 to 7 times faster. Read performance is, the claim is about 3%, 3x improvement. We have push down query execution because there are multiple engines, or rather multiple blocks that process the queries within the intelligent storage layer. So one query is parallelized and pushed down into each one of those engines, and there is push down optimization where clauses and other things are pushed down. The biggest plus for read performance is the serverless. The read compute can be scaled, and serverless has full parity with the provisioned instance. Scalability of Aurora is also very high. Aurora can scale both compute and storage. From a compute perspective, you can have 15 read replicas versus 5 for RDS. Sizes can be 128 terabytes versus 16 terabytes. Instance type scaling, compute scaling and storage scaling both don't require any downtime in Aurora. In RDS, they do require downtime. Your instance type can't be scaled. You basically have to create a new database and then do it again. Same for storage. If you have unused storage, Aurora can free it up. There is auto storage resizing. That's not necessarily the case in RDS. The biggest plus of Aurora is the replication and availability. One block of storage, and by block, I use the term block, it's a 10 gigabyte storage block, and that's replicated 6 ways, 2 copies per availability zones. So it's replicated at three locations, 2 copies per availability zone. So even if there is a loss of 1 availability zone, plus 1 node loss, that means AZ plus 1, Auroras which can still support and get back. And it has this nice mechanism of write quorum. So if anyone of you has used Cassandra, for example, Cassandra uses write quorum. How many nodes are able to write? And then it gets back, and then that's how a write is considered successful. That is the same idea that Aurora has. So it uses a write quorum of 4 by 6. That means 4 nodes have to respond with yes. Then the write is considered successful. S3 is at the back end of Aurora. So all the writes are also returned to S3, so they're extremely durable. S3 writes for RDS need to be exported. You need snapshots from RDS to make the writes more durable. You need backup retention tuned. So there's a whole lot of manual tuning involved. As compared to that, Aurora has all that inbuilt. And of course, recovery. Recovery of the log. Not all the pages need to be read back. You can just read one log entry, apply that delta to what you already have, and then you can get that data back. And that's how Aurora has the replay or the time machine kind of capability. There are differences in how Aurora and RDS treats availability zones. Aurora is multi-AZ by default. Aurora doesn't, RDS doesn't have that capability by default. You have to configure either a multi-AZ cluster or a multi-AZ database. You can use RDS proxy as a front end for clients to connect to. And RDS proxy insulates the clients from the backend disruptions or a seamless transition. RDS failovers are manual. Aurora has automatic. And again, RDS has point-in-time recovery, and you can recover backups. In Aurora, you can do backtrack and get this time machine capability.
You said backtrack, yeah, we have to restore a snapshot.
No, you can actually go back to a point in time.
Yeah, like a restore it.
It's not a restore. You can read data as of 1 o'clock
On a live.
on that pin. Since Aurora's currency is a commit log, a commit log is essentially an entry in time.
Right.
So as you traverse the commit log, it can tell you at what point in time. We talked about proxies. Serverless is the key differentiator between Aurora and RDS. We know Aurora was architected to be serverless, to be compute and storage separated, and hence we can do serverless. Serverless V2, that's the new version of serverless. There it has full parity, it's completely equivalent to the provision copy. And we can scale it for real work, for read workloads. Another differentiator is the migration path. So where you want to get to, how you want to migrate. So from a SQL Server or Oracle, moving to Aurora, you can do with DMS and SCT, or you can use Babelfish. Babelfish is a new introduction to Aurora, where it talks the SQL Server via protocol, which means the client, for the client, it assumes that it's talking to a SQL Server, but essentially it is Aurora at the backend. Babelfish has been open sourced, and it supports a lot of the SQL Server constructs. And for like to like, you can always do a PG dump, PG restore, or MySQL dump, or a Percona extra backup. So cloning is completely built into Aurora. Read-only clone is free. There is no storage used. Essentially, it's the same copy of the database. In RDS, to clone, you need to create a new database, import the data. It's a non-trivial operation. Backtrack is a key mechanism of recovery, especially when you want to go back in time. Maybe data has been corrupted, maybe something has been dropped. Or worse, there's something that is encrypting the data. In that case, it might make sense to backtrack. So for RDS, you have to do a point-in-time recovery, while Aurora has backtrack already built in. The cost. So there have been studies, there's one blog by Parkona that says, in general, they found Aurora to be about 20% costlier. This is one of those areas where your mileage may vary, kind of thing. There are some other case studies which says Aurora is cheaper, but take that with a pinch of salt, because there are additional costs with Aurora. So it costs 20 cents for 1 million reads or writes. There is network I/O cost, there is storage cost, there's a backup cost. Well, in RDS, the costs are predictable. This is more about the commonalities. Since both of them come from the same stable, same family, both of them are managed databases. We have very real skill shortages. Managed databases are the way to go. Automation, that's also another feature of managed databases. Both of them rank very high on the governance and the security front. They're very well integrated into the AWS ecosystem. Again, the idea of walking through this process is also giving you the features, but also walking you through the process of how we make a journey. So we looked at the commonalities, we looked at the contrast. So it's a compare and contrast model. And then we'll come to summarize, we'll look at what are the key wins or what are the strengths of both. Aurora has high availability built in. So if there is a choice, and this is one of your key requirements, then it has to be Aurora between these two. Performance is better, durability and management, of course, is better. Aurora is MySQL and Postgres compatible. Now, the key word being compatible, and it's not MySQL and Postgres out of the box. Scalability is better, and it has a good migration path. RDS is more simple, lightweight, for those who desire more control not just over costs and configurations, but also over data locality. Like in RDS, in Aurora, you can't really control where all your data will get replicated or copied to. In RDS, you have full control. RDS has 3 engines, SQL Server, Oracle, and MariaDB, that have no support in Aurora. MyISAM, for example, in MySQL, there is no equivalent in Aurora. So if you're tied to these, if you're tied to certain versions of MySQL or Postgres, or certain patches provided that are very custom to your environment or your enterprise, then RDS is the way to go. And RDS is true open source. Some differences in instance types. So RDS supports the M, R, or the T class machines. Aurora has R and T class machines. For RDS, the version support is a lot wider. So if you look at the subversions 5.2 dot, if you are doing a migration from some other environment, it's typically a lift and shift migration, then you would ideally want to have the version compatibility with the on-premise version if you're doing a lift and shift. Aurora supports only the 5.6, 5.7, 8.2. Similar with Postgres. RDS supports version 14 of Postgres, Aurora not yet. There are plans of getting into complete version compliance with RDS also, but that's not happened yet. So if you need high availability, then Aurora is the answer. If you don't need it, then you may need to play a game where you have to rank them, you have to weight your parameters, you have to score them, and then you come up with your final answer. Do you use technology just for the sake of technology, or do you need the additional capability? That's a very important question to answer. Enterprise scale is tempting, but it's secondary. Primarily, we should think about, are we over provisioning? Aurora actually avoids over provisioning, but it may be too heavy for the operation if you don't need that high availability. So that's a weighing game you have to play, and that's what you have to address. And it's always useful to perform a POC to find out if it really suits your needs. So to think about is, what's the penalty for a wrong choice? What's the cost of switching? What if we pick this option versus this? How much of a lock-in are we getting into? Right. So what I would typically do at the end of such an exercise is maybe have some weights or some factors assigned to each one of these capabilities. So let's say cost. Do you weigh cost to be 4 or maybe 9? But would you weigh availability to be a 9 or a 6? Okay. And this is some kind of exercise you would go through with your business partners, with your enterprise architecture team, you as cloud engineers, as data engineers, data architects, cloud architects. And then you come up with a final scorecard where you come up with your final rating. So on a score of 1 to 10, how much is each one of these factors really matter, and what's the final score? And that will point you to the right decision. And I've done these technology consulting kind of engagements, and then what I find is documenting this is usually useful because it documents not just the thought process at that time, but also the requirements. It talks about why you took the decision at that time. The decision remains objective. It's not driven by other factors, and what factors went into putting those weights, that's also important. So once we know if any of those factors have changed and those weights then get updated, then it may be a good time to reevaluate some of those weights and those factors. So having a scorecard at the end of such an exercise is useful and very important as part of documenting the decision process. Right. So that's all I have. If you have any questions, anything you want me to discuss further? Sure.
Do you have much experience with the serverless side, the serverless component of Aurora? I'm just kind of curious in terms of the performance there. The cold starts, that type of stuff. Some experience we had in the early stages of it. I haven't seen having used V2, but do you have any experience with that?
I think they are working a lot on the cold start part of it. Serverless V2 is a lot better. I personally don't have experience with serverless V2 yet. I worked on Aurora